I've noticed an ever-increasing number of people over the last few years that seem to think that their environment, whether that's their work, where they live, where they shop, basically wherever they are at that moment, these people believe that their environment ought to change for them, rather than they accept that environment and attempt to assimilate into it. This is the exact opposite of historically normal social behavior. In the past, if I were to join some group, I would immediately try and figure out the group's norms. I would keep my mouth shut and listen. I would answer questions politely, but not be overly talkative about my own beliefs while I was trying to figure out the attitude and beliefs of the group I was interested in joining. Now, for instance, I lived in the downtown area of Atlanta, Georgia for close to 30 years. The main city park, Piedmont Park, had baseball and softball fields that were also used for co-ed kickball leagues on Saturdays. My son and I would go to the park many Saturday mornings and would often sit for a little while watching those kickball games. I was always entertained watching those people. In many ways, it was like a singles bar, a singles bar atmosphere thinly disguised as a kickball league. The same personalities you expect to find at a bar on a Friday or Saturday night, any standard singles bar, pickup joint, you would find Saturday mornings at that kickball league's games. How those people interacted was fun to watch with my son. Now, the fact that it was a Saturday morning at a public park made it available for me and my son, and that was pretty cool. We got to watch how those singles behaved in a group, singles looking for the one. Normally, sitting with my elementary age son watching something like that would have been very difficult to do. But in that setting, it was a master class on the early development of his intuition, his gut feelings on behavior and trying to understand what was happening only through body language. And that's an extremely valuable skill to have as an adult. Let me take a step aside right here. In my videos, I've always tried to give parents ideas about how to develop their kids into ICD adults, independent, confident, good decision makers. I have no idea if you have public kickball leagues or anything like that where you live, but the kickball league my son and I would occasionally watch was an awesome opportunity for him to develop those intuitive skills. And think about how animated some singles can be when they're doing the things singles do when they're trying to find that special someone. Now, that behavior is definitely stepped up a notch or two, when they're at a bar, slightly intoxicated. So the behavior my son and I watched, was slightly subdued at those kickball games, but it was still on full display. It was a very fun opportunity for my son and I to sit and talk about what was happening. Now, I think my son was 6, 7, maybe 8 years old when we started doing this. And it's fun to sit and watch and make up words for the actions you're watching. It's sort of like ad libs. I mean, it can be hilarious. You're putting words to these actions that sometimes are ridiculous. At least that's what we did. Now, with a boy, many of those ad lib conversations he was making up on the spot had to do with bodily functions. As humorous as that was for him, I always tried to encourage him to try and make up words to reflect what he actually thought was happening. Now, I tried to get my son to really see the actual conversation that was taking place. It was all about encouraging him to analyze their body language, their facial expressions, all the non-verbal stuff. Now, statistically, girls are much better at reading body language than boys. So for me, I was trying to develop a skill in my son that, generically speaking, as a boy, he was probably not very good at. Now, like virtually everything I did with him, I tried to make it fun. Now, I never did this with a young girl. I had a boy. But I bet that if I had a daughter, she would have not gone, the ridiculous route like my son often did, making up crazy, slightly offensive at times, fake conversations. If I had a daughter, she probably would have been much more likely to really try and make up a conversation that she believed was actually taking place. Developing intuitive skills in kids, it's important. My use of a public setting where a very specific group of young single adults were interacting right in front of us was a fantastic opportunity to do that in a fun way, to help my son see what was actually taking place when all he had to go on were non-verbal cues. Most all of us have probably spent some of our time in our 20s at a bar doing exactly what those kickball players were doing. There are all kinds of personalities in those types of settings. Some people, are quiet, watching and waiting for a chance to interact. Others very outgoing, bold, not hesitating to start a conversation. Some interaction. Generally speaking, from a historical perspective, the quiet ones were much more likely to be the new people in the group, trying to understand the group dynamics, watching and listening to understand the group's norms before they started building their own identity within the group. This, historically, was the way most of us behaved when we found ourselves in a new group of people that were new to us. It didn't matter if that was, joining a new social group, starting a new job, whatever. When we find ourselves with people we don't know that well. Now, watching this adult behavior from a safe distance, in a safe place, that was a great way to help develop my son's intuitiveness. Try to read a situation through non-verbal cues. Now, every parent should do this with their young kids. It's early training to help them start developing their emotional intelligence. Now, there are many people that would argue that having a highly developed emotional intelligence is actually more valuable than possessing what I'll call a big brain, being smart, whatever that means. Now, that's a topic for another video, but I would strongly recommend parents with young children take some time to research emotional intelligence and how important it is to live a healthy, happy, fulfilling life. Now, let me get back to my original topic. You have to prepare for the terrain. You can't expect the terrain to change for you. And the fact that the last few generations, it's not that these generations don't agree with that sentiment. That's not the issue. The issue to me is I'm not even sure they recognize that concept in the first place. The last few generations seem to be so much more self-centered, so much more narcissistic than past generations, that their mindset is that they don't even see a new terrain. They only see a terrain that ought to change for them. They see themselves as the center of all it is. And if others don't see that, if they don't see things from their perspective, in their opinion, those people are the ones with the problem. Now, assume that everyone had this mindset. Everyone was brought up to believe that their personal feelings, their personal beliefs trump everyone else's, trump everything else. That would be complete chaos. When people go into a new situation with the attitude that the terrain ought to change for them, if everybody did that, it would be anarchy. When there's no legitimate attempt to understand others, only a mindset that everyone should see things as I see things, that's complete disorder and confusion. It's chaos. Unfortunately, welcome to the world today. That's the mindset far too many people from the last few generations have. Any situation, any basic encounter between two human beings can be interpreted very often in very different ways. You might witness some interaction between a couple. It might seem as loving by some, when someone else would consider that behavior perhaps disrespectful or rude or obnoxious. Now, as the old saying goes, it's in the eye of the beholder. Without taking the time to consider behavior from someone else's perspective, only considering it from your own perspective, you're very likely to misinterpret all kinds of things. Ultimately, what I'm really talking about here is basic manners. I'm confident you understand what I'm talking about. I'll assume you've had a job at some point in your life. I hope that's true. Historically speaking, nobody with any sense in their head would show up at a new job and start dictating terms. Now, I've mentioned in earlier videos that companies today are often reluctant to hire Gen Z workers. Why? A partial list of why that's happening includes a lack of motivation or initiative, a lack of professionalism, poor organizational skills, poor communication skills. That's just a few of the top reasons companies give for avoiding Gen Zs. That list should scare the bejeebers out of today's parents. Scare the bejeebers. That's to frighten or terrify. If you're unfamiliar with that term, try using it on someone. Scare the bejeebers. Anyway, the way we behave, the way we should behave when we start a new job, this seems to have been flipped on its head. Now today, it's not unusual for many people to believe that their mere presence in a new situation with new people gives them the right to immediately start dictating terms, inserting themselves into a new situation as if they're in charge. I'm not going to go into detail why I think this change in attitudes happened. Part of it is a rise in narcissism. That's definitely part of it. But it really doesn't matter to me why. What matters is what should matter to you as a parent is how often this behavior happens, how many adults believe this is acceptable behavior. Now, I can't imagine graduating from college with student loans of $100,000 or $200,000 and you can't find a job. No one will give you a job. I mean, it's anecdotal, of course, but the few parents of Gen Zs that I know, they're dumbfounded. A college education at a nationally recognized institution, big student loan, and their son or daughter can't find a job. I feel for them, but in many ways, I partially blame them for being in that situation. When my son was young, my wife and I purposely put him into new environments, into situations where he was unlikely to be comfortable. We did it on purpose. For instance, summer day camps. We started doing these camps when he was probably young, maybe 5 or 6 years old. We explained to him to watch and listen at first. Try and figure out the people around you. Who seemed approachable? Who seemed friendly? Who was a little nervous, just like maybe you were? Who might be open to starting a conversation? First and foremost, figure out the terrain. Where were you? Who was near you? What was going on? Eyes open, ears open, mouth shut. My son learned this at a very young age. Today, it's amazing how easily he can integrate himself into a new environment by taking the time at first to understand that environment before he tries to insert himself into it. The most basic, the simplest way to view the modern approach of expecting the terrain to change for you is it's just rude behavior. It's inconsiderate. Why is it so often like this today with younger generations? Unfortunately, we're raising a bunch of narcissists. An independent, confident, good decision maker is the opposite of a narcissist. It's an individual that knows, that understands that their own strengths and their weaknesses, they know them. It's an individual that doesn't ignore and try to hide their weaknesses while overstating their strengths. An ICD adult is comfortable with who and what they are. It's an individual that is always trying to improve themselves. And it's an individual that's comfortable enough in their own skin that they don't need to try and make themselves the center of attention all the time. Thanks for listening.